The trouble wasn't that she picked up the phone during the dinner rush. The trouble was that Keisha Williams answered in flawless Mandarin, her accent carrying the sharp precision of Beijing's diplomatic quarter, responding to a panicked voice screaming about a blown operation in Shenzhen. She hadn't uttered a single word of her former life in 3 years, and the terrified caller babbling about extraction protocols and a compromised asset made her forget every carefully rehearsed detail of her cover. Just 3 tables over, seated in the corner booth, sat Min-jun Park, the quietly infamous head of a Korean organized crime syndicate with roots stretching from Seoul to the West Coast. He didn't flinch, didn't turn his head, but the temperature in the room dropped like a stone into dark water. Keisha knew in that gut-twisting instant that the peaceful anonymity she'd purchased with 3 years of silence had just shattered. She was no longer invisible. She was marked prey. Welcome back, friends. This is Prince of Afro-Korean stories, where passion, danger, and impossible romance intersect. Please keep sharing your ideas for future episodes. And kindly like, share, and subscribe, and activate notifications so you never miss our latest content. Keisha Williams had become a master of invisibility. For 3 years, she'd perfected the exhausted shuffle of an overworked server at Bellini's, a mid-tier Italian restaurant that specialized in overcooked pasta and discreet financial transactions for the neighborhood's less legitimate businessmen. Her braids were always pulled back tight, her movements predictable as clockwork, her expression fixed in that distant, polite fatigue that made customers look right through her. The perfect camouflage for a woman who'd once been one of the most sought-after intelligence operatives in the private sector. Her current nightmare, the man who was about to tear apart everything she'd built, sat at booth 7. Min-jun Park. No one used his full name in conversation. In this city, Park was enough. He was a Korean man in his mid-30s, always dressed in perfectly tailored dark suits that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He ran the East Coast operations for a network so quiet and so efficient that most law enforcement agencies weren't even sure it existed. Park wasn't loud or flashy or demanding, which made him absolutely terrifying. He simply observed, a point of absolute stillness around which the entire restaurant's nervous energy seemed to orbit. He always ordered the same thing, espresso, no sugar, and sparkling water with lime. He never made conversation, never caused trouble, just watched the room with those dark, calculating eyes. Keisha had served him twice a week for 8 months. She'd always assumed he was monitoring the restaurant's owner, a known associate, not her. Tonight, though, every time his gaze drifted her direction, the air felt heavier, colder, dangerous. The crisis arrived at 7:43, announced by a cheap burner phone buzzing insistently in the apron pocket where she kept her order pad and corkscrew. Normally, she ignored it. The phone was for emergencies only, contacts she'd prayed she'd never need again. But the screen was flashing an international code she recognized instantly, a number she hadn't seen since she'd walked away from her old life. Every instinct, every survival protocol drilled into her over a decade of high-stakes fieldwork, screamed at her to answer. She moved quickly, slipping into the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the storage room, hoping the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the fryer would mask her voice. Yes, she whispered into the device, her tone low and controlled. The voice on the other end was frantic, tumbling out in rapid-fire Mandarin, the words barely intelligible through the panic. It was a dialect thick with urgency, and the speaker was clearly in immediate danger. Keisha, they found the safe house in Shenzhen. They have Chen. You need to abort the transfer. Abort everything now, they. The line dissolved into static, followed by a sharp, strangled cry, and then nothing but silence. For 3 years, Keisha had been nobody, just another tired waitress grinding through double shifts. In that moment, Keisha Williams, the deep cover specialist fluent in 9 languages and trained in 3 combat disciplines, came roaring back. The call lasted maybe 8 seconds, but it was enough. Shenmi Lu, she responded instinctively, her Mandarin flowing out smooth and precise, Beijing standard, flawless and formal. Fashing Lu Shenmi sure? What happened? There was no answer, just the flat hum of a dead line. Keisha stood frozen, phone pressed to her ear, the sudden silence deafening. She took a slow, controlled breath, her mind already racing through extraction protocols and contingency plans. Shenzhen, Chen, transfer compromised. This wasn't a wrong number. This was her past, kicking down the door to her present with brutal force. She slid the phone back into her apron, smoothing the fabric, her hand steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She needed to get to her apartment, retrieve the encrypted drive hidden under her bathroom sink, and disappear before dawn. But first, she had to finish her shift without raising suspicion. She stepped back into the dining room, heart hammering against her ribs, but her face reset to the blank canvas of a weary server. She approached booth 7 to refill Park's water glass, keeping her eyes focused on the task. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked in flat, unremarkable English. Park didn't move. He didn't blink. But his eyes had taken on a different quality, sharp and focused, like polished obsidian catching light. He was watching her hands, studying her posture. She knew immediately that he'd hurt her. The corridor hadn't been soundproof enough. He'd heard the frantic Mandarin, and worse, her own perfectly articulated professional response. Park had spent his entire life learning to read people. He knew 2 types, those who held power and those who served it. Keisha Williams, the waitress, had just spoken the language of power. "The water is fine." "Thank you, Keisha," he replied, and the deliberate way he said her name, with just the faintest hint of formality, sent ice through her veins. He stood up smoothly, his suit jacket falling perfectly into place, and placed a thick stack of bills on the table, far more than his simple order warranted. "I believe your shift ends soon," he said quietly, his voice a low, measured rumble. "Please don't leave the building." He walked out. Keisha felt cold sweat trace down her spine. The restaurant continued its usual rhythm. Clinking silverware, a burst of laughter from the bar, the sound of the bartender shaking a cocktail. It all felt sickeningly normal. Then the clock hit 9:15. The men began to appear. They didn't burst through the doors or announce themselves. They simply materialized, silent and efficient. 2 positioned themselves near the kitchen entrance, hands casually tucked inside their jackets. 1 took up position by the front door, nodding politely to departing customers but making sure the door never fully closed behind them. 2 more settled at the bar, ordering bottled water they didn't touch. They were all Korean, dressed in simple, expensive black clothing. They moved with the unmistakable economy of trained enforcers, every gesture purposeful and controlled. The doors weren't locked, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The customers, sensing the shift, quickly settled their checks and left. By 10 o'clock, closing time, only Keisha, the terrified kitchen staff, the restaurant owner who looked like he might vomit, and Park's dozen men remained. The restaurant was completely surrounded. The large windows now reflected the silhouettes of more men standing guard outside, positioned at every exit. Keisha picked up a damp cloth and began mechanically wiping down an already clean table. She was trapped. She hadn't just spoken Mandarin in front of a crime lord. She'd confirmed to one of the most dangerous organizations on the eastern seaboard that a highly trained operative was working deep cover on their territory. The game was over. She wasn't walking out of Bellini's tonight under her own power. The locked-down restaurant felt like a tomb. The owner, a man named Sal, had retreated to his office where the sound of his panicked phone calls occasionally drifted through the walls. Keisha stood in the center of the dining room, the polished tile reflecting the dim amber glow of the overhead lights. She was alone with the silent guards, waiting for Park's return. If this hooked you already, don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop a comment because what happens next will absolutely shatter your expectations. The waiting was worse than any interrogation. It gave her mind time to excavate the history she'd buried. She wasn't really a waitress, of course. Her name was Keisha Williams, but her operational alias had been Karen. Her specialty was cross-cultural intelligence work, extraction of sensitive information, negotiation between parties who didn't speak the same language, literally or figuratively. She held advanced degrees in linguistics and international relations, plus enough combat training to hold her own in most situations. Her current cover, Karen the Waitress, was supposed to be permanent retirement, a quiet life after an operation in Taiwan had gone catastrophically wrong, costing her a partner and earning her the permanent enmity of a powerful Chinese syndicate operating out of Macau. The phone call from Shenzhen was supposed to be impossible. Chen was a contact, a low-level operative still working for the remnants of her disbanded intelligence network. The transfer was a highly sensitive data package, a detailed record of financial transactions between Park's organization and several corrupt officials across 3 countries. It was supposed to be her insurance policy, the leverage that would keep her retirement secure. Now it was clear someone knew she was involved, and the leak was coming from inside her old network. A side door opened and Park stepped back into the dining room. He wasn't alone. With him was an older Korean man with a scarred face and the rigid bearing of a military officer. This was Choi, Park's second-in-command, a man known for his cold efficiency and absolute loyalty. Park approached slowly, his shadow stretching across the floor toward her. He stopped several feet away, his expression unreadable, but the weight of his attention was almost physical. "Sit," he said quietly, gesturing to a small 2-person table. Keisha didn't hesitate. She pulled out a chair and sat down, posture straight, hands resting calmly in her lap. This wasn't submission. This was protocol for a high-level interrogation. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Your name?" Park asked in Korean, his tone formal and precise. "Keisha Williams," she replied in English, deliberately refusing to give him the cultural advantage. Park's mouth curved slightly, a predatory hint of amusement. "The Mandarin you used on that phone call was textbook Beijing. Perfect tones, perfect cadence. It's the language of someone who either lived in the capital for years or studied at a very specific, very expensive institution. You sound like a diplomat's daughter, not someone who just refilled my water glass." He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. "And the person who called you spoke in a Guangdong dialect common to intelligence networks operating in the southern provinces. They used your real name, not Karen. They mentioned an abort, a transfer, and someone named Chen. So tell me, Keisha Williams, who are you working for? And why is this transfer important enough that someone in Shenzhen is dying over at 5,000 miles from this mediocre plate of fettuccine?" Keisha took a slow breath. This was the moment. She could lie, but the lie would be transparent to someone like Park. She needed to give him enough truth to make her valuable, but not so much that she became expendable. "My name is Keisha Williams. My cover was Karen. I'm not affiliated with your organization or any rival Korean network, and I'm not with the Chinese triads or the Russian syndicates. My work was private sector, specialized intelligence gathering for corporate security firms, The kind that pay 7 figures to prevent industrial espionage or hostile acquisitions. She watched his eyes closely. He remained skeptical but intrigued. She continued, delivering the critical detail. The phone call you heard was real. Chen was a contact. The package, the transfer, is a comprehensive digital record. It details every off-book transaction your organization has made in the last 6 years, specifically the shell companies used to move money through Southeast Asia and the political bribes that keep those channels open. It's the digital blueprint of your organization's vulnerabilities. Choi shifted his weight, a low hiss of anger escaping. Park raised one hand, silencing him without looking away from Keisha. A record, Park repeated slowly. A record that's now compromised, along with your contact. And you were planning to deliver this to whom? Your former employers? I was delivering it to myself, Keisha corrected, meeting his gaze without flinching. It was my retirement insurance. The information is too dangerous to release, but valuable enough to hold. It guarantees that certain powerful people with a vested interest in your organization's stability will leave me alone. The tension in the room thickened until it was almost suffocating. Park sat back, crossing one leg over the other, studying her with renewed interest. You understand what you've just confessed to me, Keisha Williams? You're telling me that you, the former waitress, possess the data necessary to collapse a significant portion of my organization's infrastructure, and you expect me to believe you were just going to hold it rather than sell it for protection? I expect you to believe that I value my life more than a temporary payout, Keisha countered. Selling that record would start a war. Holding it guarantees mutual deterrence. I prefer the latter. The fact that the call came through and the safe house was compromised means the other party, the one who actually wants to destroy you, is closing in. They know the record exists, and they think I have it. I'm not your enemy, Park. I'm your warning. Park stared at her for a long moment, evaluating her body language, the conviction in her voice, the sheer audacity of her confession. He was looking past the black woman in the stained uniform, seeing the intelligence operative beneath. The waitress had disappeared, replaced by an adversary he could respect. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a highly valuable, highly dangerous variable who knew exactly where the bodies and the money were buried. He chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. You were running from a small fire, Keisha, and you just walked straight into an inferno. The only question now is whether you're an asset or kindling. The early morning light was beginning to filter weakly through the restaurant's tall windows. Park had been silent for nearly 20 minutes, leaning back in his chair, his expression distant and calculating. Keisha used the silence to steady herself, focusing on small details, the pattern of the tablecloth, the faint hum of the refrigeration units in the kitchen. Anything to keep her mind sharp. The tension between them had shifted into something else, something charged and dangerous. Park found himself drawn to the rare sight of someone facing a death sentence with the calm of a chess player considering their next move. Her stillness mirrored his own, but underneath it was a volatile power he hadn't encountered in years. He wasn't just intrigued by her. He recognized her. She was a predator forced into hiding, and now the cage was open. Finally, Park leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table. The movement was deliberate, final. The record is the least of my problems, Park stated, his voice low and gravelly. The real threat is the man who compiled it. His name is Kwon, a former strategist for my organization. He built the financial architecture we use for international operations, which is how he could create the record. He's been working with rivals in Hong Kong to destabilize us by leaking information piece by piece to authorities. We're not afraid of the law, but we're afraid of chaos. Kwan's endgame isn't money. It's fragmentation. He wants to weaken us so he can absorb what's left. He paused, letting the scope sink in. You confirmed the safe house in Shenzhen is compromised. That means Kwan is moving fast. He'll assume that since Chen was taken, the record, your insurance, is now in his hands. He'll make his final move, probably tonight or tomorrow, to consolidate his position. Park's gaze locked onto hers, demanding and absolute. I don't need to threaten you, Keisha. You need me. If I kill you, the record is lost and you're just a corpse. If I let you go, Kwan's people will find you because they know you're the only person who knows where the record really is. Your apartment, correct? Keisha gave a single nod. She was already calculating how long it would take Kwan's local contacts to break her cover and get a team to her address. Hours, maybe less. Good, Park said. Your survival depends on me winning. My victory is your survival. So we're partners for the next 48 hours. He didn't ask. He dictated. He wasn't interested in her opinion, only her immediate compliance. It was the most commanding yet oddly reassuring statement she'd heard in months. What's the play? Keisha asked, her voice steady. If you want to draw him out, we need to create a credible threat. Kwan's weakness is his ego. He wants power, not wealth. We need to make him believe the record is about to fall into the hands of someone he can't corrupt or eliminate. A flicker of respect crossed Park's face. She'd shifted immediately from captive to collaborator. The dynamic was intoxicating and dangerous. Exactly. My men are good at violence, not deception. Kwan doesn't know what you look like, but he knows your reputation. He knows shadow. And he knows that anyone who speaks that kind of Mandarin in a back alley restaurant in this city belongs in a boardroom, not a server's uniform. Park stood up, circling the table to stand directly in front of her. He extended his hand, and Keisha took it. His grip was firm and dry, sealing a deadly contract. The skin-to-skin contact, the stark contrast of her dark hand against his, was electric, a sharp acknowledgement of the personal boundary they'd just crossed. He pulled her to her feet, his presence solid and commanding next to hers. He was taller than she'd expected, and she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. I need you to be the distraction. I need you to be the bait. More importantly, I need you to be the linguist. Tonight, there's a meeting between my rival and the head of a Macau triad in neutral territory. We're going to walk in there, and you're going to break their alliance before it can form. He looked her over once, his gaze sweeping from her tight braids down to her non-slip work shoes. You have 5 minutes to get out of that uniform. You're coming with me now. We don't have time for you to go to your apartment for that drive. We'll secure it later. You won't leave my sight until this is finished. His eyes narrowed, the command clear and absolute. Follow me, Keisha. Keisha Williams, who had spent 3 years running from her life, finally stopped. She smoothed her waitress uniform one last time, a farewell to the quiet, boring cover that had failed her. She looked up at Park, dangerous excitement curling in her gut. The fear was still there, but it was eclipsed by the thrill of the hunt. Lead the way, Park, she replied, her voice shedding the last layer of exhausted fervor and ringing with the clear, sharp tone of a woman ready for war. But understand this. I'll follow, but I don't take orders from anyone for long. This partnership is temporary. Park didn't respond with words, only a slight, knowing curve of his lips. He turned sharply and headed toward the back entrance where a black armored sedan was already waiting. Keisha followed, head held high, the former waitress leaving behind the grease and the guilt, walking toward a new life defined by danger, intrigue, and the magnetic pull of the man who just ordered her back into the game. We've reached the conclusion of our compelling African-Korean story. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove love can heal the deepest wounds. Share this with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Your support means everything to me. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of Keisha and Park's story. Should we continue their journey? Let us know. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.